Ethan Cole was a man who never quite fit in. In the small mountain town of Vermont, he was known for his quiet voice, strong hands, and wide shoulders that could fill any doorway. People often noticed his size before his kindness. He didn't mean to look intimidating, but wherever he went, conversations softened. Eyes shifted and whispers followed. "That's Ethan the giant from the woodshop," people would say, as if his height and strength were something unnatural. But behind that rugged frame lived a heart that longed for peace, belonging, and love. He ran a small workshop near the edge of town where he built furniture from reclaimed wood. Every morning, the sound of sanding and hammering echoed softly through the valley. He loved shaping rough timber into something beautiful, strong, yet gentle, much like the man he was. His shop was filled with the smell of pine and varnish. And in the corner stood a small coffee pot that was always warm, even if no one came to share it. People respected Ethan, but few truly knew him. The men admired his skill, but kept their distance, unsure how to start a conversation with someone who looked more like a bear than a neighbor. The women, at first glance, seemed drawn to him, the broad shoulders, the deep voice, the calm confidence. But as soon as they got close, they found reasons to leave. They said he was too much, though they could never explain what that meant. Too tall, too quiet, too kind. Ethan never asked. He just smiled and let them go. He had tried dating in the past. Each time began with curiosity and ended with silence. One woman once told him, "You don't know your own size, Ethan. It's overwhelming." That word, overwhelming, echoed in his mind for years. He learned to stay guarded, to keep his emotions tucked away behind calm nods and polite smiles. Deep down, he believed maybe he wasn't meant to be understood. Maybe he was built for solitude, for working with his hands instead of opening his heart. Every evening after closing his workshop, Ethan would walk home through the quiet streets, hands buried in his coat pockets. He'd stop by the same bakery, buy a loaf of bread, and greet Mrs. Porter, the elderly woman who always smiled at him. "You work too hard, Ethan," she would say. He'd chuckle and reply, "Someone has to keep the wood in line." She liked that answer. It was the only part of his day that felt warm. His house sat by the forest, small but sturdy. Inside, the shelves were filled with books about design, carpentry, and poetry. He didn't tell anyone he liked poetry, didn't fit the image people had of him. But on quiet nights, he would sit by the window, reading words about love and loss, imagining what it must feel like to have someone who saw beyond what others saw. He wasn't lonely out of choice. He was lonely because people never stayed long enough to know who he really was. In a world that judged by appearances, Ethan's kindness was hidden behind his size, his gentleness mistaken for power. Sometimes he'd catch his reflection in the workshop window and sigh. "You're not that scary," he'd muttered to himself. But maybe he was to those who only looked at the surface. Still, he never let bitterness grow. He found comfort in his work. Every table, every chair carried a piece of his heart. He carved hope into the wood grain as if shaping beauty could fill the quiet spaces inside him. The children who played nearby often stopped to watch him work. He'd smile, hand them a small toy he'd made from leftover wood, and their laughter would echo down the street. That sound reminded him why he still believed in kindness, even when kindness wasn't returned. Then one cold afternoon, as snow began to fall outside his workshop, Ethan sat sketching a new designer rocking chair for a client. The wind howled outside, brushing snowflakes against the window. He looked up and noticed how still everything was, how the whole world seemed to be holding its breath. He didn't know it yet, but change was coming. In that moment, he thought about the life he'd built, simple, predictable, safe. Yet deep down, something in him stirred, like a quiet longing that refused to fade. He wished for once someone would walk into his life and not see him as the giant, but as a man who loved quietly, who dreamed deeply, who wanted to be seen. He leaned back in his chair, wiped sawdust off his hands, and smiled sadly. "Guess it's just you and me again," he said to the empty room. The sound of his own voice surprised him. It had been hours since he'd spoken to anyone. The wind rattled the windows in response, almost like the world was answering. Outside, the sky grew darker, and the smell of rain replaced the sharp scent of snow. Ethan didn't notice the faint sound of footsteps approaching the workshop door. He didn't see the figure standing in the cold, hesitating before knocking. His world, built on silence and self-protection, was about to shift. When the door finally creaked open, he looked up, expecting another customer, another stranger who would smile politely and leave just as quickly. But instead, he saw a woman. She stood there with raindrops on her hair, holding a broken camera tripod, her eyes searching his. "Sorry," she said, her voice warm but unsure. "I heard you fix things." And in that simple question, Ethan's life began to change. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know her story, her pain, or her courage. All he knew was that she wasn't afraid to stand in front of him. She didn't flinch. She didn't step back. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something unfamiliar hope. As the rain drummed softly on the roof and the smell of wet wood filled the air, he took the broken tripod from her hands and said quietly, "Yeah, I fix things." But what neither of them realized was that in time, she wouldn't just fix a tripod, she would help repair a heart that had been misunderstood for far too long. That night, long after she left, Ethan sat by the fire, staring at the door she'd walked through. Her voice still echoed in his mind, calm and real. He didn't know who she was, but for the first time in years, he found himself wishing someone would come back. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, the giant who everyone feared finally began to feel small in the best possible way. It was the start of something gentle, something true. And though he couldn't name it yet, it felt like the beginning of everything he'd been waiting for. The next morning, Vermont was covered in fog. The air was damp, and the scent of pine and rain hung heavy. Ethan Cole opened his workshop early, brushing sawdust from his work table. He expected another quiet day, just him, the hum of his tools, and the echo of thoughts he never said out loud. But around mid-morning, the small bell on the door chimed again. It was her. The woman from the storm. She stepped inside, smiling shyly. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," she said, holding the repaired tripod in her hands. "I just wanted to thank you. You fixed it perfectly." Ethan nodded, caught off guard. Most people would have just picked up their repair and left a note. But she came back, standing there in her worn brown jacket and faded jeans, eyes bright like she carried sunlight even on gray days. "I'm glad it worked," said. "I'm Claire," she offered. "Claire Matthews." He hesitated before replying, "Ethan." Her smile widened. "I know. The lady at the cafe said you're the man who can fix anything." He chuckled softly. "Not everything," he said, but there was warmth in his tone that surprised even him. From that day, Claire began stopping by more often. At first, it was for small things: a chair with a loose leg, a cracked picture frame, a drawer that wouldn't close. But soon, she started coming just to talk. She'd sit on a stool near the workbench, sipping coffee from a thermos, watching him carve wood with steady hands. Claire had just moved to town after years of traveling for her photography job. She'd seen the world, busy cities, deserts, and quiet coasts, but lately she wanted peace. After a broken relationship in Chicago, she had sworn off romance. Yet something about Ethan's quiet presence felt different. He didn't try to impress her. He didn't talk too much or too little. He just listened. One afternoon, she watched him repair an old rocking chair and asked, "You're always so careful." "Why?" He looked up, his blue eyes thoughtful. "Because everything breaks easier than we think," he said. Wood, hearts, same rule. That answer stayed with her. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a rhythm. She brought him photographs to frame, and he showed her the hidden beauty in his craft. Their conversations were simple but meaningful. She told him about the mountains she climbed for the perfect shot, the loneliness of hotel rooms, the silence after a love that didn't last. He told her about the town, his mother's recipes, and how he once tried to build a boat that sank before it touched the lake. They laughed easily, the kind of laughter that makes strangers feel like old friends. And slowly, without realizing it, they started healing each other's quiet wounds. But beneath the calm moments, Ethan's old fear lingered. Every time she smiled, a voice whispered in his mind, "She'll leave, just like the rest." He tried to ignore it, but years of rejection had built walls inside him. He didn't know how to let anyone fully in. One day, Claire showed up with a box of her favorite photos, landscapes, people, sunsets. "I want to make a display for the cafe," she told him. "Would you help me build the frames?" He nodded. "Sure, but only if you promise to teach me how to see the world like you do." She laughed softly. "Deal." That afternoon, the workshop was filled with the sound of saws and her gentle humming. She moved with an energy that filled the quiet space, her laughter bouncing off the walls. Ethan felt lighter than he had in years. Every glance between them carried something unspoken, something fragile, but growing. When the frames were done, Claire ran her fingers along the polished wood. "They're beautiful," she said. "You make them beautiful," Ethan replied without thinking. The words slipped out, honest and unplanned. She looked up, surprised. Their eyes met for a long moment, neither speaking. Then she smiled softly, as if she understood everything he didn't say. The next day, she brought him lunch, homemade soup in a glass jar. "You look like the kind of man who forgets to eat," she teased. He smiled shyly. "You're not wrong." From then on, it became a habit. She'd bring him lunch, and they'd sit outside the workshop eating and watching the clouds roll over the hills. She talked about photography. He talked about woodcraft. They both talked about everything except the growing connection between them. But even as Ethan began to trust her presence, a part of him still doubted. One evening, when she invited him to join her for dinner, he froze. It was the first time anyone had asked him something like that in years. "Dinner," he repeated, unsure. She nodded. "Just dinner. No reason, no pressure. I cook well, I promise." He looked at her, her smile soft, patient, without expectation. Yet fear crept into his chest. What if she got close and realized what everyone else had? What if she left too? "Claire," he said finally, "I'm not good at things like this, things like being human." She teased gently. He couldn't help but laugh. "Something like that." She stepped closer, her voice quieter now. "Then let me remind you. Just dinner, Ethan. That's all." For a moment, he looked at her, trying to read her face, her intent. But all he saw was kindness. The kind that didn't judge. The kind that waited. He agreed. "Okay, dinner." When she left that evening, the workshop felt different. Warmer, brighter, for the first time. The silence didn't feel heavy. It felt full of possibility. Later that night, as he cleaned up his tools, Ethan caught himself smiling. He didn't even know why. Maybe it was the way she said his name, soft but sure. Maybe it was how she didn't flinch, didn't treat him like a giant or a mystery. She simply saw him. He looked out the window at the mist rising over the trees and whispered, "What are you doing to me, Claire?" Across town, Claire sat by her window, editing photos on her laptop. But she wasn't thinking about work. She kept replaying his smile, the sound of his laugh, the way his eyes softened when he listened. She had met many people in her travels, but none like him. Ethan didn't fill silence with words. He filled it with presence. He wasn't perfect, he was real. And after all the noise and rush of the world, that was what she'd been searching for. Neither of them knew where it was heading, but both could feel it a pull stronger than fear, gentler than hope. And as night settled over Vermont, two hearts that had been wandering in different kinds of loneliness found themselves thinking of the same thing, each other. What began with a broken tripod was quietly turning into something neither of them expected, a story worth fixing. Piece by piece, just like everything else Ethan touched. The night was cold, and rain tapped softly on the windshield of Ethan's old truck. He sat parked outside Claire's small cottage, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart heavy with uncertainty. The invitation had sounded simple. Come for dinner. But for him, it wasn't simple at all. It had been years since anyone had asked him into their world like that. He wasn't sure he remembered how to belong. Still, something inside him wouldn't let him drive away, through the rain. He could see the golden light glowing from her windows. It looked warm, alive, welcoming everything he didn't think he deserved. For a moment, he considered starting the engine and leaving. It would be easier that way. He could return to his quiet life, his safe walls, his silence. But then he thought of Claire, her laughter, her calm eyes, her voice that never trembled when she spoke to him. He took a deep breath, stepped out of the truck, and walked to her door. When she opened it, her face lit up. "You came," she said softly, like she hadn't been sure he would. "I almost didn't," he admitted, rain dripping from his coat. "Then I'm glad you did." She smiled and pulled him inside. The warmth of her cottage surrounded him, soft music playing, the smell of soup simmering, and a small table set for two. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like home. Ethan stood awkwardly by the door until she laughed. "You can sit, you know. I don't bite." He smiled faintly and sat down, his large hands resting on his knees. She brought 2 bowls of soup to the table and sat across from him. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence. Every now and then, she'd glance up at him, and their eyes would meet before they both looked away, smiling quietly. Halfway through dinner, Claire said, "You know, people in this town talk about you." Ethan froze slightly. "I figured. They say you keep to yourself, that you're too quiet, too strong, too big." She paused, watching his expression. "But they don't know the man who fixes broken things without being asked. They don't see the care in what you build." He stared at his bowl, not sure how to respond. Compliments were rare for him. "People see what they want," he said. "They don't stay long enough to see the rest." Claire leaned forward, her tones softer. "Then they've been looking with the wrong eyes." For a moment he couldn't speak. No one had ever defended him before. He'd grown used to being misunderstood. He wanted to thank her, but his throat felt tight. After dinner, they washed dishes together. Claire hummed quietly as she rinsed the plates, and Ethan dried them, careful not to break the delicate glass. The simple act felt intimate, not romantic in a loud way, but gentle, natural, real. When they finished, she leaned against the counter and looked at him. "You're quiet tonight," she said. He met her gaze, unsure how to hide what he was feeling. "I'm just not used to this," he said slowly. "Being around someone who doesn't." "Pull away, squaw." She tilted her head. "Pull away from what?" "From me." His voice was low, steady, but full of old pain. "People think I'm too much. Too tall, too serious, too everything. I've heard it all." Claire's eyes softened. "Ethan, size doesn't scare me. Arrogance does. Anger does. Cruelty does. But kindness?" She shook her head gently. "That's never too much." Her words hit deeper than she knew. Ethan wanted to believe her, but the fear in him was stubborn. He had spent too long expecting disappointment. "You don't know me well enough to say that," he said quietly. "Maybe," she said, stepping closer. "But I know enough to see your heart." He looked at her, surprised by the certainty in her eyes. The air between them felt charged, not heavy, just full of truth. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sound of the rain outside filled the silence. Then she smiled, breaking the tension. "You think too much, Ethan Cole?" He exhaled a quiet laugh. "Old habit? Well, maybe it's time to unlearn it." She took a step back, handing him a cup of tea. "Drink? It helps." He took it, their fingers brushing for a second. The touch was small, but it felt like a spark. He didn't pull away this time. Neither did she. They sat near the fire afterward, the glow flickering across the room. Claire talked about her travels, the desserts, the cities, the way the world looked through her camera lens. Ethan listened, fascinated. She spoke with such life, such warmth. It made him forget the loneliness that used to fill his nights. When she paused, he finally spoke. "Why did you move here? You could have lived anywhere." She looked into the fire, her voice quiet now. "Because I got tired of chasing things that never stayed. I wanted peace. I wanted real." He nodded slowly. "I understand that." Their eyes met again, and this time neither looked away. The space between them seemed to disappear. For a moment, Ethan forgot the walls he'd built. He just saw her and the way she looked at him, not with fear, not with judgment, but with something like recognition. But then, as the rain grew louder, The old fear returned. What if this was temporary? What if she woke up one day and realized he wasn't the man she thought he was? What if she left too? He stood suddenly, setting his cup down. "I should go," he said. Claire looked surprised. "It's pouring outside. I'll be fine." He reached for his coat. She stepped closer, searching his face. "Ethan, what are you running from?" He didn't answer right away. Then, with quiet honesty, he said, "I've lost enough people to know how it ends. I'd rather leave before I have to watch someone else walk away." For a second, she didn't move. Then she said softly, "Maybe you keep losing people because you walk away first." He froze. Her words hit like lightning sharp. True, impossible to ignore. She sighed and touched his arm gently. "You don't scare me, Ethan. Not your size, not your silence. You've built a life where everything fits except love. Maybe it's time to make room for that too." He looked down at her hand on his arm, small, steady, fearless. For the first time, he didn't know what to do. He'd built his life around being careful, but her presence made careful feel lonely. The thunder rolled outside, and Claire smiled faintly. "You can leave if you want, but maybe you could stay for one more cup of tea." Ethan hesitated. His heart said stay. His fear said run. But then he saw the quiet hope in her eyes, and something inside him shifted. He hung his coat back on the hook and sat down. "One more cup," he said. Claire smiled softly, pouring the tea. Good choice. They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with something gentle. Something real. And that night, as rain whispered against the windows, Ethan realized this was what he'd been missing all along. Someone who didn't see his size or strength as something to fear, but as something to understand. Someone who stayed. Spring came slowly to Vermont. The snow melted off the mountains. The rivers began to sing again, and life returned to the quiet town. In Ethan's workshop, sunlight now filled every corner. The same space that had once felt empty was now alive. Laughter sometimes echoed there, and the smell of coffee often mixed with sawdust. Claire had become a part of his days as natural as morning light. She came by with her camera, sometimes to take photos of his work, sometimes just to sit nearby while he carved. She said his calm helped her think. He said her presence made silence feel warm. It had been months since that rainy night in her cottage. The night Ethan had almost walked away, but didn't. Something had shifted between them since then. They didn't need to talk about it. They just understood. They shared their time easily, a cup of tea, a walk by the lake, quiet dinners that stretched late into the night. Their bond wasn't dramatic or loud. It grew quietly, like the roots of a tree, strong, unseen but steady. One morning, Claire arrived at the workshop holding a stack of photographs. "I want to do something special," she said, laying them on the table. They were pictures of his woodwork, chairs, doors, toys, and tables, each one glowing under her lens. "These should be shown," she continued. "You make art, Ethan. People should see it." Shook his head, embarrassed. "I just build things, Claire. That's all." "No," she said firmly. "You build pieces of yourself into them. That's what real artists do." He didn't argue. He had learned something about her. Once she believed in something, she didn't let go. So when she said she wanted to organize a small exhibition for him at the local gallery, he let her. He didn't think anyone would come. But they did. On the day of the event, the gallery was full. People walked between the displays, admiring the craft, asking questions. Ethan stood quietly in the back, uncomfortable with the attention, until Claire appeared beside him, her hand brushing his. "You did this," she whispered. "You brought beauty into this town." He smiled shyly. "No, we did this." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. In that crowded room with all the noise and movement, they stood still. For a moment, it felt like the world had slowed just for them after the event. They walked home together under the soft evening sky. The stars were out and the cool breeze carried the scent of pine. Claire broke the silence first. "You know," she said, "you've changed." "Changed?" he asked. She nodded. "When I first met you, You looked like a man who carried the weight of the world. Now you look lighter." He thought for a moment. "Maybe it's because someone helped me put it down." She smiled. "Then I'm glad I came to your workshop that day." "So am I," he said softly. The next weeks passed peacefully. They spent more time together, sometimes helping neighbors with small repairs, sometimes driving through mountain roads just to see the sunset. They didn't call it love, not out loud, but both felt it growing stronger with each shared day. One evening, as they sat by the lake, the sky turning gold and pink, Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a wooden heart, carefully carved, smooth as silk. He handed it to her. "What's this?" Claire asked, smiling. "A piece of the oak table we built together," he said. "You said you wanted to take memories with you. This one's solid. It won't break." She turned it over in her hand, touched by the thought. "It's beautiful." He looked at her, his voice quiet but sure. "So are you." The moment hung between them, simple and honest. Then she leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. They didn't need more words. The silence said everything. As the weeks passed, Ethan realized something he had never understood before. Love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about the small things. The laughter shared over breakfast. The way she noticed the details no one else did. The way her presence made him feel seen, not for his strength or his size, but for his soul. But one afternoon, when Claire didn't show up at her usual time, worry stirred inside him. Hours passed, and finally, just before dusk, she arrived, tired, eyes red. Camera bag hanging loosely by her side. "What happened?" he asked gently. She sighed and sat down. "I got a job offer," she said quietly. "A big one. National Geographic wants me to travel again 6 months across Europe." He froze. It was everything she had once dreamed of. But the thought of her leaving tore something inside him. "You should go," he said after a moment. "That's who you are, Claire. You were made to see the world." She looked at him, her voice trembling slightly. "And what if I don't want to leave this time?" He shook his head. "You've spent your life chasing beauty. Don't stop now because of me." She reached for his hand. "Maybe I've already found it." The room went silent. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. Ethan wanted to tell her to stay, to say that life without her laughter would feel empty. But he couldn't be selfish. So he smiled, though it hurt. "You'll come back," he said softly. "You always fix what you love, even distance." Tears filled her eyes. "You really think I'll leave you?" He hesitated. "I think. If love is real, it always finds a way." A week later, she left for her trip. The workshop felt quiet again, the air heavy with memories. But this time, Ethan didn't retreat into his loneliness. He kept working, carving new designs, writing her letters he never sent, every night. He looked at the stars and imagined her under the same sky. 6 months passed. Then one morning, as he opened the workshop, he saw a figure standing by the door. A familiar smile. A camera hanging from her neck. "Claire," he said, barely believing his eyes. She grinned. "Told you I'd come back." He walked toward her, and before he could speak, she held up the wooden heart he'd carved. It was worn from travel, but still whole. "This never left my pocket," she said. "It reminded me where home is." He took a deep breath, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. "You found your way back." "I always would," she said softly. "You're the only thing I didn't want to run from." And just like that, the story that had started with misunderstanding and fear ended in quiet certainty. The giant everyone once whispered about was no longer alone, in his small workshop by the forest. Ethan finally understood love wasn't about being enough for the world. It was about finding one person who saw you completely and stayed. As he wrapped his arms around her. The smell of pine filled the air, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt complete. He was no longer the man people feared. He was simply a man who had been found by love, the kind that stays.